Hello and welcome to another Autodesk Alias Subdivision tutorial. My name is Johan Wendesten and today I will show you how to model this Arne Jacobsen Ant Chair. No time to waste, let's begin. I will start off by importing the image references. So I go to the front view and then I choose File, Import and Canvas Image. And I make sure that Always Create New Canvas is enabled. Then I click Go and I choose the front view. I set the transparency to 0.5. I want this chair model to be life-sized, and I know that it's roughly 80 centimeters tall, 80.6 to be exact, in real life. So I will create a distance locator with that same height, and then I will match my canvas image to the distance locator. I do so by moving over to the palette, where I choose Locators, Measure, and Distance. Then I snap the start point at the origin. After that I go up to the command input, where I type 00 and 806, and this gives me the distance locator. Then I select the canvas image and I snap the pivot to the bottom. And then I simply snap move the canvas image to the grid, so it's standing centered on top of the XY plane. And now I'm scaling to make it match the distance locator. And I think that should be fine. And then let's switch over to the side view to repeat the process. So I once again import the image, then I snap the pivot to the bottom, and I align the canvas image to the grid before scaling it until it matches with the distance locator and our front view image. And now I want to move it a little bit to the side so it's out of the way, and the same goes for the front view. And there you can see me trying to move the canvas image with the transform move tool, and it turns out it doesn't really work on canvas images or planes, so for this I have to use the legacy move tool. I get rid of the distance locator since it's redundant at this point, and then I will create a new layer. I name it Reference Images, and then I add the canvas images to that layer. So there we go. And now I can't select them by accident. Since I will be creating subdivision models, I'll go to Preferences, Workflows, and Subdiv. And by the way, this can also be achieved by simply pressing Ctrl 5 on your keyboard. Anyhow, this gives me access to all the juicy subdivision tools through the shelf, hotkeys, and marquee menus. And with all the preparations out of the way, we can finally begin modeling. There are as many ways of modeling this as there are modelers. Well, that might be a slight exaggeration, but what I'm trying to say is that there are multiple different ways you can do this, and I will just show you my take on it. And usually what I like to do is to select a primary view, the view with the most information or shape in it. So in this case it would be the front view. And then I start my model in that view to get the proper setup and topology. And whenever I can't get any further, I switch views and I go on from there, and so on. And I don't know if I explained this very clearly, but hopefully you will see what I mean as soon as I start modeling. Anyway, for this I will start out with a subdivision plane, which I place in the front view. And then I pick vertex, and I snap the vertices to the center. Then I proceed to select and move vertices until my plane is matching with the reference image. As soon as I'm happy with my first face, I create a new layer. And then I assign the face to that layer. This is so I can turn on symmetry for the layer to get a symmetrical representation of my model. I use Pick Edge to select an edge, and then I use the Extrude tool to create another face. And I pick another edge, and I extrude once again to create yet another face. And then I just repeat this process, so extrude, and pick edge, and extrude. And this gives us our initial blockout of the seat backrest. And now it's just a matter of selecting vertices and moving them to try to match the shape as closely as possible. And when I feel that I can't get any further, I use the Insert Edge Loop tool to insert a few extra edge loops. I generally like to place new edge loops roughly in the center, but here I want to create a corner where I'm placing this edge loop really close to the other one. And whenever you add a new geometry, you need to make modifications to the model to make sure that you're matching with the reference image. And the reason I'm doing it this way, adding a few edge loops at a time rather than adding them all at once, is that I now make sure that I don't end up with too many edge loops, which can be a real problem. Since this oftentimes leads to that you kind of lose control over the model. So in general, you want as few edge loops as possible while still being able to obtain the desired shape. And speaking of that, I'm now happy with the way my front view looks. So I select the bottom row of edges, and then I use the extrude tool to extrude the seat of the chair. And as you can see, this gives us kind of a weird banana shape, but it can easily be fixed by just inserting an edge loop close to the corner. Then I move into the side view to make further modifications to the seat. While in the top view, I insert a few extra edge loops. I then use this new geometry to shape the seat the way I want it. And notice how the vertices are closer together at this corner, where I want a smaller radius. And as you can see, I kept the model flat or planar up until this point, and that is because it makes it so much easier to modify it. But now it's finally time to start adding some 3D shape. So I select all these vertices and I erase them slightly. And then I select only the outer row. So give me a minute, yes, and then let's raise that even more to create a nice curve. Then it's back to the side view to create a curve in this view as well. And here you see me just hopping between views and making tweaks until I'm happy with the result. I need to add a curve to the backrest as well, so I select all these vertices and then I move them slightly. I want the curve to be almost flat close to the symmetry line, and then for it to have more acceleration the further away it is from the center. It's hard to tell from the photos, and maybe the backrest is actually more curved in real life, but I will settle for this for now. I go into box mode by pressing 1 on my keyboard, and if you're a Maya user like I am, then you're familiar with this. Anyhow, I feel that it's easier to evaluate the model in box mode, and here I'm looking for potentially twisting faces. So like this one, for example, I need to modify slightly to make it not twist. And that one looked fine, so that I can skip for now. Now it's time to tilt the backrest. And for that I will use a tool which I feel is oftentimes overlooked in Alias, the lattice tool. So I go to Object Edit, Dynamic Shape Modeling, and Lattice Rig, and this gives me the lattice toolbox. And then I select all the vertices I want to modify, I click Lattice, and I move this out of the way, and then I click Engage. And this engages the lattice, so now I can just select these manipulators, and if I move them you will see that I actually tilt the backrest of the seat. So let me try to get the proper angle. Maybe a little less. A little less. Maybe a little less and a little more. Okay, maybe that's perfect. So whenever I'm happy with changes, I just select the geometry and I delete the history, and then they are permanent. I want to make some more modifications to the backrest, but since we tilted it, I can no longer use the X, Y, and Z movement. So instead I have to rely on the Transform CV Parallel tool. And with this I can move a CV parallel to an edge, just like that. And here you see me using it once again to make this tiny tweak to that one vertex. I'm sure that will make a huge difference in the end. Now I want to add some thickness to the seat by extruding all the faces. But before I do that, I need to make a duplicate of our subdivision object, and you will see why in just a minute. So I select it, and then I use Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V to make a copy, and I hide that copy. Now I pick face, and I select all the faces, and then I make use of the extrude tool. And it's important that I set it to normal. And if I just pull this arrow, you'll see that I'm able to add some thickness to the seat. Maybe a little more? That should be fine. If I then turn off the symmetry for a moment, you will see that the extrusion created these faces across the symmetry line, which I don't want. And in order to delete them, I use pick face to select the first face. Then I hold Shift and click with my middle mouse button to chain select all the faces in between. And now I can just use delete to get rid of the faces, and the problem goes away. You will also notice that the top of the seat is missing, the A surfaces if you will. This happens whenever you extrude faces, and that's why we made the duplicate of our object before extruding, remember? So let me first of all unhide that object. And if you look closely at this corner over here, you'll see that we have a problem. And it's because the objects are not welded together. But we'll fix this by using the weld tool. So I click this icon over here, and I set it to tolerance, and I make sure that the tolerance is something small, and then I just drag select. And you will see that we welded everything together, and the problem went away. As of right now, the seat has this knife edge quality to it, which we of course want to get rid of. So I use the insert edge loop tool to insert edge loops very close to the border, and you will see that this fixes the problem. I then want to do some last minute modifications, and I once again use the transform CV parallel tool to make sure that I'm not distorting the shape. Let's get rid of this seam line. And the way to do that is to create geometry from the layer. So I go to Layers, Symmetry, and Create Geometry. And this gives me two separate objects, which I now will need to weld into one. So I go to the top view, I select all the vertices at the center, and I scale them to make sure that they are aligned to the symmetry plane. I press the weld button, and wouldn't you know, the two objects are combined into one, and we have no more seam line. What we have though are these ghost surfaces that you might remember from the rocket video, and I just get rid of them. Let me tweak this slightly because it looks a bit flat. That's better. And maybe this one needs to be changed as well, by using the Transform CV Parallel tool, as always. Okay, I think that is it as far as the seat goes. So let's make this into a template and then move on to the legs. Whenever you're making 3D models, you have to keep the purpose of the model in mind. So if this was an actual production model and the seat was going to be manufactured, then I would rely on curves and the profile tool to make sure that the legs were up to par. But since this is merely a visualization model, which will be used for an occasional render or two, I will kind of do this the quick and dirty way and rely solely on subdivision models. For the leg, I will start with a subdivision cylinder, which I then scale to make it match the image reference. And that's something I haven't talked about yet, is that since I'm using perspective images as my reference, but I'm modeling in orthographic views, I kind of have to translate from perspective to orthographic myself and make an estimation of what's right. So it's never going to be a perfect representation of the actual real-life seat modeling this way. But I guess it's close enough for the purpose of this tutorial at least. I go to the top view, so I can easily select all the faces on one half of the cylinder, which I then delete. I proceed to make a copy of my cylinder, which I rotate 90 degrees in the Y direction. I position the cylinder just beneath the seat. I then take my first cylinder and I rotate it according to the image reference, and then move it into place. As of right now, there is no way of unifying these two pieces by way of a Boolean operation, at least not that I know of, so I have to do it the manual way by using the cut tool. So I make a cut on one of the cylinders, and then I make the corresponding cut on the other one. And now I can easily just select all the faces I don't need and get rid of them. And I've noticed that I can only cut through half a cylinder, so that's why I deleted the other half before performing the cut. Now I enter the weld tool, and I set the tolerance to a large number. Notice that I'm welding edges this time, instead of vertices. With the two pieces finally connected, I set the pivot to one of the vertices on the symmetry plane. I then make a mirror copy of my object. To combine the two halves into one object, I once again make use of the weld tool. But this time I have to set the tolerance to something significantly smaller. And then I simply just drag select across all the vertices of the symmetry plane to weld them together. So how do we add some more definition to this banana shape? Well, if you guessed by adding a few extra edge loops close to the corner, then you were right. I set the offset mode to distance, and I start to drag from the opposite end of the corner because I want the inserted edge loops to inherit the alignment of the leg endings. So in this case I want them to be vertical or horizontal respectively, rather than rotated. And I don't know if it makes any sense the way I explained it, but try inserting a few edge loops with the offset mode set to relative instead, and you will see what I mean. I used the fill hole tool to create a face at the very bottom of the leg, and it's not because I really need it, since that part of the leg will be covered up anyway, but I will rotate the leg and I need a point to snap the pivot to, and that's what I'm doing here, trying to snap the pivot to the center vertex point. And there we go, I finally did it. Now I go to the front view, and I use the rotate tool to rotate the leg into place, and I think I will go for an angle of 40, so almost there, just a little more. That's perfect. And now I can just get rid of these faces, since I don't need them anymore. I've noticed that the leg isn't tall enough. So I select all the vertices at the top, and then I once again make use of the transform CB parallel to extend it upwards. And I have to admit, I'm not really sure about the shape of the upper part of the leg, but it looks to me as if it's bending upwards slightly as it approaches the center. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I insert a few extra edge loops. Then I'm selecting these vertices and I move them upwards slightly. Maybe this one as well. I have a feeling this might be incorrect. So if you own one of these chairs, why don't you send me a message and tell me what it's supposed to look like. It's time to create these plastic/rubber feet, or whatever you want to call them. And for that I will use the leg as the starting point. So I use the insert edge loop tool and I set it to distance, and then I insert an edge loop right about there. And now I select the faces, and I will use a tool that we have not used before, the extract tool. And I set it to keep original, and I click go. And this gives me a duplicate of those faces, which I now can make some further modifications to. So I select all the faces, and then I click the extrude tool. I make sure that it's set to normal, and then I drag this blue arrow to add some thickness. I select the border edge loop, and then I want to fill the hole. I use the cut tool to split this 8-sided face into 4 4-sided faces. I select the newly created faces. I enter into the move tool, and if I then click this adjust manipulator button, it lets me align the pivot to a component. So in this case I would choose the vertex. When I'm happy with the alignment of the pivot, I press spacebar to go back into transform mode, and now I can just move the faces in the normal direction. And the same goes for this vertex over here. And this lets me add some crown to the bottom surface in a controlled fashion. Now I select this edge loop, and I will make use of the transform CV slide. And I slide all the vertices down to chamfer that ledge off a little bit. And I also want to simulate a flush condition between the foot and the leg, why I'm adding this inside flange. Now this object is still a bit too soft, but that's nothing that a few extra edge loops can take care of. So I use the insert edge loop tool to add some definition to the model. And with that, I will consider it finished. Let's move on to the next part. For this one, I will start out with a cylinder. I scale it and move it into place. Then I create a duplicate, which I offset or scale a bit. I can now isolate these two objects. I select these 4 top faces and get rid of them. Then I select these 2 edges and I will use the extrude tool to extrude them. I scale them a bit to create the tapered shape that we want. Then I insert an edge loop exactly in the center and I repeat for the opposite side. I select these 2 edges and I will use the bridge tool to bridge the gap between them as soon as I hit the spacebar on my keyboard. My plan is then to make another bridge between the inside and outside cylinder. But in order to perform a bridge, you need equal amounts of edges. That's why I insert this extra edge loop at the center of the top face. Now I can select the outer border edges and the inner border edges. And I once again use the bridge tool. I click this button over here or the spacebar, and that creates the bridge for me. Now I need to align this. So I will select all the vertices and then make use of the scale tool. And I repeat this action for the rear until it's completely flat. Now I need to add some definition to the model, and as you know, that means extra edge loops. So I insert 1 close to the outer border and 1 close to the inner border. That looks good to me. I need to make this object symmetrical, so I snap the pivot to one of the vertices of the symmetry line, and then I simply mirror it over. Lastly, I combine the 2 objects into one by selecting these vertices and clicking in the Weld tool button. And of course it's way too wide by now, so I need to select all the vertices and scale everything in. Then it's time to position it correctly. So I move it into place. Then I rotate it. And for now I will just eyeball it. Okay, so some quick last minute tweaks and then we are good to go. And lastly, I will just create a rough model for the parts that acts as a cover for where the legs are attached to the seat. So I once again start out with a cylinder. I move it into place and I scale it. I isolate it so I can more easily see what I'm doing. I then fill the hole and I proceed to use the cut tool to clean up the topology, just like we did before. Now I can select these vertices and scale them in slightly. And I will add an extra support edge loop. To add some crown and definition to the shape. It is finally time to select these objects and untemplate them. So this one needs to be moved down slightly. And it also looks to me as if it's a bit rotated, so I will try to match that. Now, since these pieces on the bottom are going to be hardly visible anyway, I'm not gonna bother to trim them. But depending on the purpose of the model, doing so might be a good idea. I'm not sure if the front legs and rear legs are identical. From a manufacturing and economic standpoint, that would make sense, but I don't know if it's feasible. For simplicity's sake, I will, however, make a group out of the front leg geometry and make sure that the pivot is at the origin. And then I will simply duplicate it. Now I need to make a few modifications to it. But first I move it into place. And you can see it's protruding through the seat. So I select all the top vertices. And then I once again rely on the Transform CV parallel tool to shorten the leg without bending it or distorting it. These vertices also need to be moved down slightly. Okay, that looks about right to me. So now I can just mirror these objects over to the other side. And before I do so, I need to make sure that the pivot is actually at the origin. And then I just duplicate. And there you go, we have all 4 legs. Whenever you create tutorials, you kind of have to accept the fact that the models you make in those tutorials will not be perfect. But this model has one error that is so glaring that I just can't let it go. And you probably already spotted it. And I'm of course talking about the thickness of the seat, because as of right now you can see it's way too thin. In fact, it needs to be almost twice as thick to match the image reference. So let me address that. And I think that the most simple and straightforward way of doing this is to simply redo the whole extrusion process that we did earlier. Before I can do that, I however need to take a few steps back. I choose Pick Face Loop. And then I drag select in the direction I want the loop to run. So now you see I selected all the faces in this loop, all around the seat. Then I simply delete them. This splits the mesh into 2 separate objects, one of which I can delete. And now I'm kind of back to square one, just where I want to be. Before extruding, I once again make a copy of my A surfaces, which I hide. Then I proceed to select all the faces, and I go into the extrude tool. I set it to normal, and I make sure to make it a little bit thicker this time. So that should be fine. And look what happened here. I can't really explain that, but I can show you how to fix it. So I get rid of one of the halves, and then I set the pivot to the center, and I simply make a duplicate. And now it's just a matter of welding these two together. So I go into the weld tool. I set the tolerance to a small number, and then I drag select to weld. But as you can see, the tolerance was a little bit too small, so I need to increase it. And when I now tried to weld, it worked, and it welded everything together. I then unhide my A surfaces, and I isolate select them. Now I need to weld these two as well. So I go into the weld tool once again and I drag select. And you see they are now merged into one object. Then it's just a matter of adding support edges. One at the top and one at the bottom. And now our seat more closely resembles the one in the image reference. And that makes me happy, and so that I can sleep at night. We're not completely out of the woods yet though, because I need to raise this up slightly to account for the new thickness. So maybe a little bit more. I think I can do more. Oh, not that much. So let me try to redo that. Okay. Yeah, I think that's about right. And I also need to modify the legs. So I select them and I select all these vertices. And now I move everything upward slightly. And I need to make modifications to the front legs as well. So let me turn off the controls for the rear legs and then I select them. And I pick these vertices, which I then move downward slightly. And that looks about right to me. And while I'm at it, making last minute tweaks and final adjustments, there is one last thing that I want to address. You see, I think that the radius where the legs are bending is a bit too small. So I select all these vertices and then I use the transform CV slide and I slide them downward. And with that, I think that our chair is finally finished. Now it's far from perfect, but hopefully you can do a better job with it. Anyway, that's it for now. So thank you for watching and see you in the next video.